There's something oncologists have understood for decades that rarely makes it into public conversation. Cancer doesn't appear out of nowhere. It feeds. It has metabolic preferences. It has favorite fuels. And there are 5 foods that give it exactly what it needs to grow, divide, and resist your immune system. One of those foods is probably in your kitchen right now. Another one you likely had this morning. I'm Dr. Bennett. I've spent years analyzing oncology literature and tumor metabolism, translating it into information that real people can actually use. What I'm sharing today comes directly from peer-reviewed research, including classifications from the International Agency for Research on Cancer, the WH that evaluates carcinogenic evidence using the most rigorous standards in public health science. Before we go any further, I need to be direct about something important. What you're about to hear is educational information based on scientific research. It is not a substitute for medical care. If you have an active cancer diagnosis or are currently undergoing oncological treatment, work with your oncologist before making any dietary changes. The information I'm sharing is preventive in nature, and that distinction matters enormously. Prevention and treatment are entirely different conversations, and confusing them can be dangerous in both directions. That said, what I'm going to show you matters for virtually everyone because cancer has a biology we can understand. And understanding it changes what you decide to put on your plate, not out of fear, but out of knowledge. Today, you'll see exactly which 5 foods the evidence identifies as most favorable to the tumor microenvironment through which specific biological mechanisms each one operates, and what to actually do with that information in a practical, sustainable way. By the end of this conversation, you're going to look at your pantry differently. If you find value in this, subscribing helps me keep doing this kind of research. No pressure. I just want you to know it makes a difference. Let's start with the one that surprises people most. Not sugar, which everyone suspects. Not processed meats, which many already know are problematic. The one that genuinely surprised me when I went deep into the literature was the oil sitting in almost every Western kitchen. The one most people use thinking it's healthy because they've been told so for decades. Most refined vegetable oils used daily, sunflower, corn, soy, canola, have a metabolic characteristic that creates a systemic environment favorable to tumor growth. Not dramatically, not overnight, silently, cumulatively, over years and decades. The problem is the ratio between omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids. The human diet evolved with an omega-6 to omega-3 ratio of approximately 4:1. The contemporary Western diet has a ratio of 15 to 20:1. Multiple reviews in journals like Prostaglandins, leukotrienes, and essential fatty acids, and in nutrition have documented this imbalance as one of the most consistent systemic inflammatory drivers we know of. Here's the mechanism, and I want you to understand it clearly because it matters. When you consume large quantities of omega-6, your body converts it into arachidonic acid. Arachidonic acid is the substrate for the enzyme COX-2, which produces prostaglandin E2-PGE2, and PGE2 does 2 things that cancer loves. First, it suppresses the activity of NK cells, natural killer cells, the immune cells specialized in detecting and eliminating tumor cells before they establish themselves. Second, it stimulates angiogenesis, the formation of new blood vessels that a tumor needs to grow beyond a certain size. Without angiogenesis, tumors can't grow. With elevated PGE2, tumor angiogenesis is actively promoted. Think of excess omega-6 as bribing the body's security guards to let the tumor pass undetected. NK cells are those guards. PGE2 is the bribe, and that bribe is being paid every time you cook with refined sunflower oil. There's an even more directly damaging variant worth mentioning separately. Reheated vegetable oils, those used in industrial fryers, those reused at home when frying multiple times, generate oxidized fatty acids and toxic aldehydes that are directly genotoxic. They damage DNA. Research published in nutritional epidemiology journals in recent years is consistent on this point. Excess omega-6 oils, especially when oxidized by heat, are not simply neutral for health in oncological terms. They create a chronic inflammatory microenvironment that favors multiple oncogenic processes. The practical solution isn't to eliminate all fat, it's to change which fats you use. Extra virgin olive oil for cold use and moderate temperature cooking. Avocado oil for high heat cooking because its smoke point is higher and its fatty acid profile is more stable under heat. And one absolute rule: never reuse oil that's already been heated. The second food is the one most people already suspected, but the magnitude of the mechanism is considerably more serious than people usually imagine when they simply say sugar is bad. Refined sugar and high fructose corn syrup aren't direct carcinogens in the technical sense, the way a nitrosamine is, for example. Their mechanism is more indirect and more systemic, but that doesn't make it less relevant. If anything, it makes it broader and harder to isolate in any single study, which is precisely why it's so pervasive. Tumor metabolism has a characteristic that biochemist Otto Warburg first described in 1956, and that modern research in Nature Reviews Cancer and Cell Metabolism has confirmed expanded and deepened extensively. Cancer cells consume glucose at a rate 10 to 100 times higher than normal cells, even when sufficient oxygen is available, and normal cells would be using the far more efficient mitochondrial oxidative phosphorylation. Tumor cells prefer glycolysis. This anomalous metabolic behavior is the Warburg effect, and it's one of the most universal and consistent traits of cancer we know. But the most relevant connection to refined sugar goes beyond simply providing glucose as fuel. The most important mechanism involves IGF, one insulin, like growth factor 1. When you consume refined sugar or any high glycemic index carbohydrate, your blood glucose rises rapidly. Your pancreas secretes insulin to normalize it, and that insulin spike stimulates hepatic production of IGF-1. IGF-1 is a signaling molecule that under normal conditions regulates cell growth and survival during development. The problem is that tumor cells in the vast majority of cancer types studied have a significantly higher density of IGF-1 receptors than normal cells in the same tissue. They are particularly sensitive to this growth signal. When IGF-1 binds to its receptors on a tumor cell, it activates an intracellular signaling cascade involving the PI3K, AKT, and TER pathways. Those pathways do two critical things in tumor biology. First, they accelerate cell proliferation. Second, and perhaps more importantly, they increase resistance to apoptosis, the programmed cell death mechanism that normally eliminates damaged or abnormal cells before they become a problem. Tumor cells with elevated IGF-1 signaling are literally harder to kill by the normal cellular quality control mechanisms. The relationship with age is especially relevant for people over 50. Insulin resistance increases naturally with age. That means the same gram of sugar consumed produces higher, more prolonged insulin spikes than in a younger person, which generates more IGF-1 stimulation. For someone over 50, sugar isn't simply empty calories. It's a metabolic signal that directly activates the growth mechanisms that tumor cells have learned to exploit. The practical modification here doesn't require eliminating sweetness from your life. It requires eliminating the sources of ultra-fast absorbing glucose, sugary beverages, industrial pastries, high fructose corn syrup that appears in a remarkable number of processed products from sauces to bread. Whole fruit is completely different in this context because fiber slows the absorption of natural sugars and attenuates the insulin spike. We're not talking about eliminating apples. We're talking about sodas, packaged cookies, and products with HFCS on the ingredient label. The third food is where most people experience the most emotional resistance. And I understand that because we're talking about something culturally embedded in daily breakfasts, family picnics, culinary traditions across virtually every culture. In 2015, the International Agency for Research on Cancer of the WHO, after reviewing more than 800 independent epidemiological studies, classified processed meats as a group 1 human carcinogen. Not probable, not possible, confirmed with evidence sufficient to establish causality. Group 1 includes tobacco, asbestos, ionizing radiation, and processed meats. That classification doesn't imply the magnitude of risk is equivalent to tobacco, which has a far greater carcinogenic effect, but it establishes that the causal evidence is of the same quality and solidity. The most documented specific evidence is for colorectal cancer. The IARC analysis found that every additional 50 grams of processed meat consumed daily, roughly 2 strips of bacon or 2 standard-size hot dogs, is associated with an 18% increase in colorectal cancer risk. That number may sound moderate in the abstract, but colorectal cancer already has a high incidence in the population, especially after age 55. And an 18% relative increase applied to a significant baseline incidence produces an absolute number of additional cases that public health epidemiologists consider meaningful. The mechanism involves three distinct and documented pathways. The first is the nitrites added during curing and preservation. In the acidic environment of the stomach and small intestine, nitrites combine with amines naturally present in food and intestinal secretions to form nitrosamines. Nitrosamines are direct carcinogens that form covalent adue with DNA. Specific research on LGR5+ intestinal stem cells, the most important stem cells of the colon for mucosal renewal, documents that these adue can introduce mutations in the APC and P53 genes. Mutations in APC and P53 are exactly the initiating mutations of the adenoma-carcinoma sequence that is the most common pathway to colorectal cancer. The second pathway is heterocyclic amines formed during high-temperature thermal processing, specifically during industrial smoking and curing. The third is hem iron from red meat, which in the colonic mucosa catalyzes lipid peroxidation and endogenous formation of nitroso compounds. The distinction between processed meat and fresh meat is real and important. IARC classification for fresh, unprocessed red meat is Group 2, a probable carcinogen with weaker, less consistent evidence. The specific problem is in the processing, salting, smoking, the addition of nitrites and nitrates curing. A fresh chicken breast and a package of bacon have completely different risk profiles. Practically, this means drastically reducing or eliminating cured ham, bacon, hot dogs, processed sausages, and deli meats. If you consume meat, choose fresh meat with cooking methods that don't generate excess heterocyclic amines. Moist cooking like stewing or poaching, moderate temperatures, avoiding charring on the grill. The fourth food is the one that generates the most resistance because for years the narrative of healthy red wine, cardioprotective moderate drinking, and the French paradox was firmly established. That narrative has some validity for certain cardiovascular outcomes. But the story changes completely when the subject is cancer. Alcohol is a Group 1R carcinogen for 7 types of cancer: mouth, pharynx, larynx, esophagus, liver, colon, rectum, and breast. 7. And the evidence published in the Lancet Oncology and BMJ in recent years is explicit on a point that needs to be said plainly. There is no level of alcohol consumption that is safe from the perspective of cancer risk. Risk begins with the first drink, increases with quantity, and there is no threshold below which risk disappears. The central mechanism is acetaldehyde. When your liver metabolizes ethanol through the enzyme alcohol dehydrogenase, the first product of that reaction is acetaldehyde, which is substantially more toxic than alcohol itself. Acetaldehyde forms covalent adducts with guanine in DNA. These adue can block DNA replication and generate mutations in the next round of cell division if they aren't repaired in time. But there's a second layer of damage that makes acetaldehyde especially problematic. In addition to directly damaging DNA, acetaldehyde inhibits the DNA repair enzymes that should correct that very damage. Specifically, it inhibits LDH2, the enzyme that eliminates acetaldehyde itself, and compromises the function of proteins like BRCA2 that participate in homologous recombination repair. It's a double sabotage. It introduces errors into the genetic system and then deactivates the correction system. The most accurate analogy I can offer: alcohol is like a saboteur who first writes errors into the cell's genetic code and then disables the error detection software. Errors accumulate without correction. In tissues with high cell division rates, oral mucosa, esophagus, colon, breast epithelium, that progressive accumulation of unrepaired mutations is the documented beginning of the carcinogenic process. The resveratrol argument for red wine exists. It's real that resveratrol has antioxidant and sirtuin activating properties documented in vitro. The problem is that to obtain biologically meaningful doses of resveratrol from wine, you need to consume quantities of wine that the ethanol itself would make incomparably more harmful than any potential benefit from resveratrol. If the goal is resveratrol, supplements deliver therapeutic doses without the ethanol damage. The cost-benefit equation for red wine, when the outcome parameter is cancer rather than cardiovascular health, is unfavorable. For people over 50, this point has additional relevance. Cellular capacity to repair DNA damage declines with age. Exactly. When a lifetime of alcohol consumption has accumulated more adducts, older cells face a slower repair system for more accumulated damage. Acetaldehyde finds progressively more permissive terrain. The fifth food isn't a specific ingredient. It's a category, and it's perhaps the most practically relevant because it's the umbrella containing many of the problems we've described separately all at once in a single product. Ultra-processed foods are the vehicle for multiple simultaneous carcinogens and tumor promoters. The most cited study in this area is Fiel and colleagues published in BMJ in 2018 using data from the Nutrient Santé cohort with prospective follow-up of more than 100,000 adults. The conclusion was that every 10% increase in the proportion of ultra-processed foods in the diet was associated with a 12% increase in overall cancer risk and an additional 11% for breast cancer. Specifically, follow-up cohorts through 2024 in cancer epidemiology have confirmed and extended this finding across European, Latin American, and North American populations. But the most important finding from that study isn't that percentage. It's the complexity of the mechanism because there's no single responsible substance. Ultra-processed foods are a multifactorial problem operating simultaneously through several pathways. Emulsifiers like carcinogen or E471 alter the gut microbiota composition and increase intestinal permeability, creating chronic systemic inflammation. Systemic chronic inflammation and the pro-inflammatory tumor microenvironment are two sides of the same coin. Synthetic dyes like FDNC colorings present in dozens of products from beverages to cookies have evidence in animal models of direct genotoxicity. Advanced glycation end products AES form during high-temperature processing accumulate in tissues and activate RAGE receptors, which in turn activate NFC-capab, one of the most documented pro-inflammatory and pro-tau transcription factors in molecular oncology. And there's a fourth mechanism that, in my view, is the most underestimated of all displacement. When someone fills their diet with ultra-processed foods, they're displacing from that diet the foods with documented protective effects. Broccoli and its sprouts with sulforaphane, fatty fish with omega-3, fruits with polyphenol, legumes with prebiotic fiber. The harm of ultra-processed foods isn't only what goes in. It's also what doesn't go in because of what does. The classification of ultra-processed isn't complicated in practice. If the ingredient list contains more than 5 components you wouldn't find in a home kitchen, if it includes emulsifiers, colorings, artificial flavorings, stabilizers, if the product needs those additives to have the taste or texture it has, it's ultra-processed. A natural yogurt is milk and bacteria. An apple is an apple. An industrial cheese snack has 19 ingredients, none of which is primarily cheese. The recognizable ingredients rule is an effective filter for most purchasing decisions. Now, let me give you the practical protocol because information without actionable direction doesn't serve the purpose of this channel. Before I go into the protocol, I need to be explicit. Everything I'm about to share is meant as a complement, not a replacement to your current medical care. If you're under oncological supervision or the care of any specialist, show this information to your doctor and decide together what makes sense for your specific situation. Dietary prevention and medical treatment are conversations that can complement each other but cannot substitute for one another. The first priority, the highest impact change for most people, is the oil audit and substitution. Look at the oils in your kitchen right now. If you have refined sunflower oil, corn oil, soy oil, or canola oil, those are the ones to replace gradually but consistently. Extra virgin olive oil for cold use and moderate cooking up to 350 degrees Fahrenheit. Avocado oil for higher temperatures. This substitution maintained over months and years reduces the systemic omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, and with it the PG2 production that suppresses anti-tumor immunity and promotes angiogenesis. The second step is eliminating sugary beverages and dramatically reducing refined added sugar. I'm not talking about counting every gram or eliminating all fruit. I'm talking about a category shift in beverages. Water, green tea, black coffee as default drinks instead of sodas, industrial juices, and energy drinks. Green tea mentioned in the oncology literature for its EGCG content has evidence of inhibiting tumor angiogenesis in experimental models, making it a substitution that isn't simply neutral, but potentially active. The third intervention is reducing processed meats. Frequency matters as much as quantity. The epidemiology of colorectal cancer shows that risk is cumulative and dose-dependent. Daily consumption is different from occasional weekly consumption. If you want animal protein, fresh chicken, fish, eggs, and fresh and processed red meat are categories with completely different risk profiles from deli meats and bacon. For alcohol, the recommendation the oncological evidence supports is maximum reduction. Every drink less is literally less acetaldehyde forming adducts with the DNA of your tissues. And for ultra-processed foods, the most effective practical rule I know is the recognizable ingredients rule. If you have to Google what an ingredient in the label is, you probably shouldn't be buying it. On the positive side, 3 categories of foods that oncology research mentions most consistently as protective: sulforaphane from broccoli and especially from broccoli sprouts, which have concentrations 100 times higher than mature broccoli, activates the NRF2 factor, the master system for protecting DNA against oxidative damage. Curcumin from turmeric combined with black pepper, which multiplies its bioavailability up to 20 times, inhibits NF-kappa, be the same pro-inflammatory and protumeral factor that NS from ultra-processed foods activate, and omega-3 fatty acids from fatty fish walnuts and flax seeds directly counteract the excess omega-6 we discussed at the start, restoring a more physiological ratio. A clarification of result timelines. Oncological prevention doesn't have the 2-week result profile we'd all prefer. Cohort studies measuring cancer risk working years and decades. What you can measure in the short term are markers of systemic inflammation. High sensitivity C-reactive protein HSCP is the most accessible. If after a month of these changes you request it on your regular blood work, you can see whether systemic inflammation is moving in the right direction, and reduced systemic inflammation is exactly the microenvironment that makes life more difficult for cancer. Inflammatory markers begin to shift in weeks. The gut microbiota, which has growing evidence as an oncological protective factor, starts changing in composition within 4 to 8 weeks of consistent dietary changes. Changes in actual epidemiological risk are measured in years, but the biochemical modifications moving in that direction are measurable much sooner. I want to be completely honest about what this information can and cannot do. Eliminating these 5 foods doesn't guarantee you won't get cancer. Cancer has multifactorial causes, including genetics, environmental exposures, and random factors in DNA biology that we don't control. What this information does is reduce the burden of modifiable factors that create the most favorable microenvironment for tumor development. We don't control all the factors, but over diet we do. And that control exercise consistently over years has a real epidemiological impact. We started with the question of which foods feed cancer. The research points to 5 categories with solid evidence. Refined vegetable oils with excess omega-6 that create a pro-inflammatory microenvironment through PGE2. Refined sugar that activates IGF-1 signaling through insulin spikes that tumor cells exploit preferentially due to their high receptor density. Processed meats that the IARC classifies as confirmed group 1 carcinogens with a documented nitrotive mechanism that directly affects colon stem cells. Alcohol that damages DNA with acetaldehyde, while simultaneously deactivating the repair systems for that same damage, and ultra-processed foods that accumulate multiple damaging mechanisms in a single product while displacing protective foods. What makes this different from generic eat healthy advice is the precision of the mechanism. It's not that these things are vaguely bad, it's that each one interacts with tumor biology in specific, measurable, documented ways. That specificity is what allows you to make informed decisions rather than follow a list of forbidden foods you don't understand. Navigating oncological health information is complicated because there's a lot of noise and a lot of contradictory information. And people with cancer diagnosis sometimes use information like this in ways that really do warrant medical supervision. The fact that you've sought to understand this at a mechanistic level is already different. You have more control over your body's microenvironment than you probably thought when you started watching this video. If this topic raised questions for you, The next video goes deep on the relationship between gut microbiota and colorectal cancer, the piece most often overlooked in the preventive conversation and where research in the last 3 years has produced findings that genuinely surprise me. Comment below which of these 5 surprised you most or which you find hardest to modify in your current diet. I read all the comments, and they guide what I research next. Keep investigating, and I'll see you in the next one. Dr. Bennett.